Hello, hello again. Today we will be talking about motivation. Motivation specifically in context of organizations. Similar to the topic of leadership or power for that matter, this is a huge topic. We could literally spend one full semester talking about motivation alone. There are numerous theories on motivation and tons of research papers that have been published on the topic of motivation in the field of psychology and in the field of organizational behavior. So there's a lot that you could learn about motivation, and those insights could help you enhance your motivation as well. If you do motivational video search on YouTube, for example, you probably will find hundreds and thousands of those videos, right? Which gives the indication that people want to be motivated, but often they are not as motivated as they would like to be. So their motivational levels are not to the optimum. That is the reason there is a market for motivational speakers. There is a market for these motivational videos. We will talk about these quick fixes later on. But from the phrase quick fixes, you probably have figured out that such approaches of enhancing one's motivation is probably not as effective. So we need to approach motivation from a scientific perspective. What is an approach to motivation that works? What are those approaches for which there is evidence of it working? What are those approaches for which there isn't much evidence of it working, even if they are very popular on the internet, right? So these are some of the topics that we will be talking about. But before we delve into all those details, we will take a step back and I will start putting motivation in the context, in its proper context. Why does it matter? And what what role do leaders play in enhancing motivation? So we will put everything in perspective. We have been talking a lot about leadership. This initial discussion will help put things in perspective. Okay, so that's where we will start. To put things in perspective, let's go back to the definition of leadership, which we of course have discussed several times. But it is important that we do this because it then put things in perspective. It makes us realize how different concepts are related to each other, right? In any case, we define leadership as the process of influencing others to attain some common goals or mutually agreed upon goals, right? So if I try to represent this pictorially, I have the leader here in this blue smiley represented that way. Then I have the people whom the leader is trying to influence through these yellow smileys, okay, smiley faces. So leader is trying to influence a group of people. They could be his employees in case of organizations, or outside organizations, they could be anyone. The leader is trying to influence people to attain some goal, right? So I have the goal or goals represented here in this red concentric circles representing the target or the goal that the leader wants achieved. So leadership is this entire process of influencing the people to attain the goals. Now, if I restate this definition slightly, essentially what are we talking about? We are talking about the leader trying to get these people motivated to work towards this goal, attainment of the goal, That's ultimately then what leadership is. So we need to then understand what exactly motivation is. What motivates people? Before we discuss about the steps that leaders can take to motivate people, we need to have some good idea about what generally motivates people. Then the leader can take the necessary steps to motivate them, right? Okay. So that is the reason we are not delving directly into the several leadership theories and instead spending time to discuss motivation, to understand what generally motivates people, okay? Or what demotivates people. That could be a flip side to that as well. But even before we gain understanding about motivation, we also need to have a good understanding about this goal that you are trying to get accomplished, right? We need to have, again, very good clarity in our thinking. What is it that we are trying to accomplish through these people? Obviously, the goal is something that the leader cannot accomplish on his own or on her own. That is the reason he or she needs people to work towards attaining the goal. But we need to have clarity about what that goal is. The greater clarity we have about what those goals are or what those goals should be in organizational contexts, then we can spend our time devoting to understand motivation of people. And finally, we will spend time understanding the different steps that the leaders can take to motivate people. So this is how we are placing things. We will start essentially with understanding the goals, then we will focus on understanding what motivates people, and finally, in the later part of the semester, we will talk about the various steps that the leaders can take to motivate people so that this goal can be accomplished. Now, let me delve a little deeper into this. You will remember we discussed something called leadership effectiveness, and that there are two main parameters based on which we evaluate leadership effectiveness. There are more, but those two are the most important ones and the most commonly used parameters to evaluate leadership effectiveness. One was the actual accomplishment of goals. If the leader is accomplishing goals, then we will say that the leader is being effective. And the second was how satisfied or dissatisfied the employees or the followers were, their affective state. Those were the two main parameters based on which we evaluated leaders' effectiveness. So let's start with goals. The goals could be at the organizational level or the team or group level goals. So if it is the organizational level, it could be increase in market share, increase in profits, uh, whatever, return on investment, all that stuff. But those organizational level goals can be accomplished only when all the individuals working in the organization accomplish their goals. Then collectively, the team level goals or the organizational levels goals will be accomplished, right? So before we accomplish or in order to accomplish those organizational level goals, the individual level or the employee level, each individual level goals or outcomes need to be accomplished. There needs to be high job performance at the individual level. So we need to have then good clarity about what job performance means for an individual. When we have that clarity, then we can work towards enhancing people's job performance. And then when all employees are performing at a higher level, then collectively the organization's performance will be higher, right? So we need to understand what job performance is. But before I delve into job performance, I must also mention job performance is not the only goal or the only objective. We need to make sure that the employees are satisfied as well, because that is one of the other measures that we use to evaluate leaders' effectiveness, right? So we will then spend time talking about job satisfaction. There are numerous theories on job satisfaction. We will spend substantial amount of time to understand what job satisfaction is. We will also spend time on talking about organizational commitment. These are all individual level or employee level goals that the leader wants to accomplish. I will talk about organizational commitment later, but for the time being, the way to understand organizational commitment is people wanting to stay in the organization, not leaving the organization. So as a leader, you want your good employees to stay within the organization. If they quit, then of course, that is not being helpful to the organization. So for the leader, these three goals, or these are the three objectives that the leader strives to attain. And when these goals are attained, this collectively leads to higher team or organizational level performance. So these employee level outcomes, okay, they are then influenced by different psychological mechanisms within the individual, within the employees. So that's where motivation comes in. What are the different factors that contribute to people being motivated, which then would lead them to higher job performance? Job satisfaction is an outcome that people or that leader want, and that people would also like to want to be satisfied. But you would have also heard of the idea that satisfied employees tend to perform better. So job satisfaction then can be the mechanism that enhances job performance. Okay, so we can place job satisfaction also as a mechanism to enhance job performance. There are too many of these, so let me clear this now before. Okay, so similarly we have stress. If employees are stressed on their jobs, then that can potentially hinder their job performance. That can potentially want them to leave the organization. They will not be as committed to the organization. They may then not be very happy on their jobs. They may be dissatisfied, and so on and so forth. Similarly, there are other mechanisms as well. Whether they trust the organization, do they trust the leaders? The different decision-making processes that go into their mind. All these things influence people's job performance or their performance on their jobs and their commitment to the organization, whether they intend to stay or leave, and how satisfied or dissatisfied they will be. Okay, so and the leader comes here. There are several leadership level factors that influence employees' motivation, job satisfaction, stress, justice, decision-making processes. So the leader's ability matters, leader's personality matters, the specific actions that leaders take, those things matter, the leader's values matter. All these things contribute to employees' satisfaction, motivation, stress, and so on and so forth. So this is putting everything in perspective. But again, realize leaders are not the only people or only factors that influence these individual level mechanisms. there are factors within the individual as well that influences satisfaction, motivation, stress, and so on and so forth. For example, a you would have come across people who generally are not very motivated. You know, you may try really hard to motivate them, but they are not very motivated. You may have come across people who are not very able or maybe highly competent. So those factors are something that also influence these individual level mechanisms and the individual level outcomes in terms of performance, commitment, and job satisfaction. So why am I talking about this? Because do realize that yes, leaders will influence the individual mechanisms and the individual outcomes and ultimately the group outcomes. But leaders are not in complete control over everything. There are factors outside the purview of the leader that also influence people's performance. And that is what is shown here, these individual level factors. And there could be other factors, situational factors. Situational factors. It could be the culture of the organization. It could be the culture of the nation where the organization exists. It could be the nature of the work that people are doing. You could realize some of the motivational mechanisms that may be applicable, let's say, in a for-profit organization may not necessarily be applicable in a non-profit organization. Within for-profit organizations, again, things may be dramatically different in a manufacturing setup versus in a sales service kind of organization. So whole host of factors contribute to individual job performance as well as group level job performance. So we need to take all of these factors into account to ultimately be more successful in achieving these team or organizational level outcomes. Okay, so this is the big picture that I always want you to have in your mind when you are trying to take on the role of leadership. There are certain things that you will play as a leader that will influence people's motivation, satisfaction, stress, and everything, which then will contribute to their performance and ultimately the group performance. But then there are other factors within those individuals that also contributes to their individual level mechanisms and outcomes. And do not ignore the situational factors as well. So when we come to the different leadership theories, there are certain theories that place a lot of emphasis on the situational factors, but we will discuss these things later. When we were discussing leadership effectiveness, we talked about different organizational level performance parameters. For example, profits, return on investment, return on assets, increase in market share, and many other examples, right? So we have already discussed the different organizational performance parameters. So now we will focus on individual level job performance parameters. We will try to understand what exactly do we mean by job performance. Most people believe they understand job performance really well. That can sometimes be true because people have had experience of working in jobs and jobs being evaluated, or they having evaluated other people's jobs. So sometimes they may actually have a good understanding of job performance, but more often than not, even with all their experiences that people have on jobs, do not understand job performance really well. And that is problematic because if you don't understand job performance well, then you will not be able to perform well on your job. And when it comes to leadership, you will not be able to enhance the job performance from your subordinates, from your employees, from your followers, you need to have good clarity about what job performance exactly means. Only then will you be able to focus on the right things. So, job performance is a complex concept. It can be understood from multiple perspectives. It has multiple dimensions as well. So, from a leader's perspective, it is important that you gain a good understanding of what job performance really is. And then you will know what to target when you are aiming to enhance the job performance of your subordinates, of your employees. So most people believe, or most people think of job performance in terms of outcomes. If I take the example of a salesman working, say, at a car dealership, how would you measure the salesman's performance? Most of you would say based on the number of cars this person sells. Let's say you are the salesman. That's how we will measure your performance, right? And that's fair, right? If you sold 100 cars this month, then we will say that you are definitely a better performer than your colleague, say, who sold only 20 cars, right? Some would argue that may not necessarily be the best measure, because it is possible that you sold those 100 cars at a heavy discount. Just to get those 100 number, you sold them at a heavy discount. So the dealership where you are working actually didn't make as much money from your sales of 100 cars as it did from the sales of those 20 cars that your colleague made, because your colleague sold really premium cars which have high markup. So even though your colleague sold only 20 cars, your dealership may have actually made more money. So if we measure performance of sales employees, let's say in terms of the dollar value of sales, in terms of revenue they generated, or in terms of profit that they helped make for the company, then we may end up with another decision about, or conclusion about, who is a better performer, right? We could measure outcomes in terms of number of sales or in terms of dollar value. But either case, we are measuring performance in terms of outcomes, sales outcomes, okay? But that is certainly one valid way of measuring performance, job performance. But there's another way of thinking about job performance, which we can say is the behavioral approach to job performance. So another way of thinking about it is the process goals versus outcome goals. You may have heard these terms before. So another way of measuring job performance is in terms of thinking of the behaviors that the sales employees engage in. It doesn't matter what profession. Right now we are talking about sales example. And why do we need to have these different perspectives of job performance? Before I discuss the behavioral perspective, let's discuss some of the potential disadvantages of measuring sales or measuring job performance only in terms of outcomes. What are some of the major disadvantages if we think of job performance only in terms of outcomes, which is the most common way that people think about job performance? You can pause the video here and think about it. Well, there are many potential disadvantages. There are merits, of course, of measuring job performance in terms of outcomes, because it is typically more objective measure, and typically also measures that when we combine the performance, individual job performance of many people, that automatically leads to the performance of the organizational unit, right? If we are talking about the dealership, you sold 100 cars, your colleague sold 20 cars, somebody else sold 50 cars, and combined we know that 180 cars were sold, or whatever, 170 cars were sold, right? So we know the organizational performance if we add up the performance of all the individuals. So there are many benefits of studying performance from the outcome perspective, but there are a lot of negatives as well, a lot of disadvantages, especially when we get too focused on measuring performance only in terms of outcomes. One major disadvantage is people may engage in unethical behaviors to get that sales target or get that outcome measure based on which you are evaluating performance. So typically, when it comes to behaviors, some of the good behaviors that should lead to higher performance would be, how much time are you spending in making sales calls? How many cold calls are you making? So sales calls, cold calls, following up with customers, reading the necessary literature, or communicating the merits of each vehicle during conversations. So these behaviors, if you are engaging in more such behaviors, that should all lead to higher sales volume, right? But there could be some unethical means through which you may also enhance your outcomes. You may steal customers from your colleague. So that is, say, behavior 4. That is not how we want you to enhance your outcome measure of job performance, but that is something that may happen, right? Or you may fake sales numbers, sales that actually haven't happened. You haven't, let's say, gotten the money from your customer, but you included that as a sales. So all kind of unethical practices people engage in when organizations tend to be heavily focused on only the outcome measure of any form of outcome measure of job performance. And this also leads to a lot of undercutting that happens between employees, right? We call that social undermining. You may try to literally sabotage somebody else's efforts so that you don't look as bad. So there's a lot of problem with respect to measuring job performance only in terms of outcomes. Some of the other potential problems would be extraneous factors, right? Your sales numbers, or for that matter, the sales revenue that you generated, is certainly influenced by your effort, okay? But there are factors outside your control that also influence your sales numbers. Yes? Some, say, new company moved to Fort Wayne, and that may just increase your performance because that company then is buying a lot of cars, and that's how and that company, let's say, is located in the territory that is yours, and that can enhance your performance. And it was not because of your effort, but it was just a fluke, extraneous factor that enhanced your performance. Performance can similarly be affected negatively because of extraneous factors, like the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted performance of many people, right? They were not necessarily factors within their control. They got infected, or their common mode of sales may have been affected. right? So a whole host of extraneous factors can influence these outcomes as well. And we may then give you credit for the outcomes that you did not actually generate, or we may penalize you for outcomes that you did not get, which we should not, because it was the extraneous factors that led you to decline in those outcomes, right? So that's another major problem with respect to focusing only on outcomes when we are talking about job performance. The last one I would say, and probably, well, amongst the important ones, the another major problem with respect to measuring out only outcomes is that it does not tell you how to enhance those outcomes, right? We know that you sold 100 cars. That's a big number. Average sales say is only 60, you sold 100. So just based on that performance measure, we know that you performed well. But it doesn't give us any insights about how can this be repeated month after month, quarter after quarter. Or let's say you did not succeed in reaching the sales targets. You had to sell 60 cars, you could only sell 30. If we only focus on outcomes, we won't know what needs to be fixed to get that outcome, that job performance outcome that you want from your employees, right? So if we want to fix issues, if we want to learn, then we need to focus on the behaviors that contribute to the outcome measures of job performance. So in the field of organizational behavior, we certainly talk about outcome measures of job performance, but we place a heavy emphasis on the behavioral approach to job performance as well. So what are these specific behaviors that you should be engaging in on your job? Are you engaging in those behaviors? If you are, then we would say that you are a good performer. If you aren't engaging in those behaviors for which we have hired you, then we would say that your job performance is poor. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about, or another way of thinking about job performance. Now we will delve deeper into the behavioral approach of job performance. Let's delve a little deeper into the behavioral perspective of job performance now. What I have shared so far on this behavioral perspective is what we call is task performance. So the task performance behaviors are defined as employee behaviors that are directly related to transformation of organizational resources into products and services. In other words, these are the behaviors that employees engage in for which they have been hired. Are you, as an employee of the organization, engaging in those behaviors for which you have been hired, for which you are getting your salary? That's what we are referring to as task performance behaviors. There are several subtypes of these task performance behaviors. Number one is routine task performance. So these are behaviors that you engage on a regular basis, on a routine basis. So if you are a salesman, you are making sales calls, you are closing sales, you are meeting customers, you are holding meetings with them, you are visiting customers, for instance, right? If you are a server at a restaurant, your routine task would be taking orders from the customers, checking on them on a periodic basis with respect to how they are finding the food, checking on their needs and serving the food. So these will be the routine task behaviors for a server, and so on and so forth. There is this excellent resource. It's the website link is here, onetonline.org. That will give you these list of tasks that you need to perform for any job under the earth, almost any job. Okay, I have taken a screenshot for a job, for example, like helpers and roofers from this same website, ownit.online. It tells you all the different tasks. This is not an exhaustive list. If you maximize it, you will be able to see all those tasks that roofers have to engage in. What are the technological skills they need? What's the knowledge that they need? The general skills. What kind of abilities do they need to have? What are the different work activities they have to perform on a regular basis? So it is not, you are only seeing 5 activities here, but these are not the only 5. There are 5 of 36 that are displayed. So if you maximize it, then you can see all those 36 activities that a roofer engages in. Detailed work activities, the kind of context in which they work. So you can take almost any profession. You will find on this website the list of tasks that they engage in. So these tasks are what you engage in when you join the company or the organization. So this is why you have been hired. So are you engaging in those behaviors? If you are, then we would say that you have high task performance. If you are not sufficiently engaging in those tasks, then we would say that you are not a good performer. Taking something that you may relate to very easily, going back to the server example, if you do not take orders from your customers, or if you do not check on them periodically, then we would say that you are not engaging in sufficient amount of those task behaviors for which you have been hired, right? Then it would mean that you are a low task performer. But when we talk about task performance, we do not just talk about routine task performance. We also talk about adaptive task performance. So these are demands that do not come to you on a frequent basis. These are novel, these are unusual. So routine task is something that you perform on a regular basis. So it is very predictable. But adaptive task performance is not as predictable. Going back to the server example, how do you handle a unruly customer, for example? That is not something that may happen on a regular basis. Let's say it's a family restaurant where you work, you never have problematic customers, and yet on a particular day you have a horrible customer who is shouting and throwing a fit. How do you handle that? Or let's say you get a customer who has a child with autism. How do you handle these unusual situations? This is what we call is adaptive task performance. So we are measuring your task performance based on your performance in these behaviors, in these unusual situations. Or going back to something similar to the server, a flight attendant. There are routine tasks that the flight attendant performs, right? Again, taking care of the safety measures and sharing all that information to the passengers, serving them, all those routine tasks that the flight attendant may perform. But let's say there is suddenly unusual heavy weather conditions become really horrible, or there is some terrorist attack, somebody trying to hijack the plane. Those are situations that are happens once in maybe 10,000, 20,000 flights, or maybe even rare. I don't know the exact numbers. So This is adaptive task performance. This is a completely novel situation for which you may have had some training, but still the actual situation may be completely different from the theoretical training that you may have had before. So how do you perform under such circumstances? We need to take those things into account when we are talking about adaptive task performance. Finally, there is something within task performance which we call creative task performance. So this is developing ideas, products, something that is both novel as well as useful, because you can come up with things that are novel but not necessarily useful. Your job as a server at the restaurant, you may come up with some really great idea of a particular food item that can even though that is not part of your job, but while conversing with the customers, or you may come up with an idea that may be a huge hit. So this is then creative task performance. Now, not everything that is creative is necessarily useful. That is the reason we are saying it should be novel as well as useful, right? If I am a fashion designer and I come up with the idea of a bikini made out of some metal, aluminium or steel, steel bikini. It's novel. It's nothing that has probably been made, but it is not useful. It's probably more problematic than even being useful, right? Because of the weight and because of the injuries that it can cause. So the ideas that you come up with, they need to be novel, yes, something that hasn't been thought of before, but they also need to be useful. That's what we are referring to as creative task performance. So there are multiple dimensions within task performance itself that can be used to evaluate your job performance. But task performance is not the only thing when we think of job performance. There are other things that we need to take into consideration as well. And there are two that we will talk about, two important ones. One is organizational citizenship behaviors, and the third one is counterproductive work behaviors. These are behaviors that one should not be engaging in. Okay. We will now elaborate on these two different types of behaviors. So organizational citizenship behaviors, OCB for short, these are discretionary behaviors that are not part of the employee's formal job requirements. What are part of the employee's formal job requirements? Those are task performance behaviors, which we have already discussed, right? But organizational citizenship behaviors, these are not part of the formal job requirements. These are discretionary, meaning the employee has the discretion to engage in those behaviors or not engage in those behaviors. Nonetheless, if employees engage in these behaviors, it promotes the effective functioning of the organization. That is the reason these behaviors are actually valued a lot in the organization. These are not required. These are discretionary, meaning the employee has the choice of engaging in them or not engaging in them. But if the employee engages in these behaviors, it benefits the organization a lot. So even if these behaviors are not required, these behaviors tend to be valued a lot by leaders in organizations. So that you are clear about what organizational citizenship behaviors are, here is the summary slide that enumerates the three main components of organizational citizenship behaviors. These behaviors are discretionary. In other words, people have a choice with respect to whether or not they want to engage in these behaviors. Why do people have a choice? Because it is not a formal requirement. Because organizations haven't hired you for these behaviors. Organizations have hired you to engage in the task performance behaviors. So the citizenship behaviors are not part of the formal requirement of your job description. But when you engage in these behaviors enhance the functioning of the organization. It makes the organization more efficient or more productive. So it's really good for the organization. Can you think of examples of behaviors that would meet these three criteria, which then we would call as OCBs or organizational citizenship behaviors? So you can pause the video here and think of some of those behaviors. Of course, I will share examples of some of these behaviors in the next slide, but I want you to pause the video and think of some of those behaviors. Here are some examples of organizational citizenship behaviors. Dennis Organ, the person who came up with this concept of organizational citizenship behaviors, he initially identified these 5 dimensions of OCBs. Dennis Organ actually was my professor at Indiana University. He was also on my doctoral committee, on my dissertation committee. And that's the reason I have also conducted research on organizational citizenship behaviors. In any case, I'm digressing. The examples that Organ gives of citizenship behaviors, these are not an exhaustive list. He talks about 5 different types of citizenship behaviors. But since that original paper, there have been thousands more studies that have been done on organizational citizenship behaviors. In fact, it is one of the most researched topics currently in the field of organizational behavior in my field. So many more types of organizational citizenship behaviors have been identified and is being researched upon. But Organ initially identified 5. First one is altruism. Altruism is nothing but helping a colleague in their tasks, in their task behaviors. When a colleague of yours is struggling, let's say, with something, some task behavior, and you help that person out, you are engaging in altruism or helping behavior, which is nothing but a type of organizational citizenship behavior. You are taking time out of your work to help this person. Let's say it's about computer coding. That's what you are. You are a computer coder, and your colleague is struggling with something, and you help her out on those computer codes that she is responsible for. So you enhanced her job performance and indirectly then the organization's job performance. By engaging in this helping behavior, you also improve the climate within the department, within the organization. People will then become much more cooperative, they will be much more supportive of each other, which is ultimately going to help the organization. But such helping behavior, you realize, was not part of your job requirement. Your job requirement was to engage in the behavior for which you had been hired, which was to write codes for whatever product that your company is making, right? Similar examples or other examples of organizational citizenship behaviors are courtesy, which, for example, would be keeping your co-workers informed about the developments that you are making, for example, as opposed to being secretive. Now, if you keep your colleagues informed about whatever developments you are making, that can then help in the performance, in their performance, right? If you are secretive, then they will not know what development has already happened. They may invest time and energy recreating things that you have already made, and those time and energy ultimately gets wasted because you have already created that, right? Um, or when you share this information, they can build on that information and then uh, be more, come up with something new, right? So these courtesy behaviors then enhances the performance within the organization, within the division, within the department, within the team that you're working in. But again, these behaviors are typically not required by the organization. The third category of behaviors that Organ talks about are what he calls conscientiousness behaviors. There is, by the way, a personality trait of conscientiousness, and that's not what we are talking about here. Here, Organ is talking about a set of behaviors, which is nothing but going above and beyond what is required from your job. Okay, you are going above and beyond what is required. Example would be going back to the example of the server at a restaurant. The requirement may be that after you take the order, after you deliver the food on the table, you check back every 20 minutes. Okay, but you may check back more frequently even if it is not required. I'm just giving an example. Or let's say you see a customer with kids, and kids have some special needs. You, even if it is not required part of your job, you actually help those kids out. Let's say take them to the restroom, or when they spill the food, you help those kids. That was not something that was required part of your job, but you went above and beyond what was required and did a better job. So this is what we call our conscientiousness behaviors. So your job was not to help those kids to, or one of those kids to the restroom, right? But you did it, which was ultimately good for the restaurant where you work, because it developed, um, it helped the customers appreciate the services that they were getting from the restaurant. Clear? Your job timings may be from, let's say, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. But you may decide to stay a little late to get certain job done. Okay. Again, this was not required, but you did. Even if you are not getting any overtime, your job may be something that does not give you any overtime, and yet you may stay longer, complete the task so that the report would be ready, or the customers will get what they need the next day, right? So these are examples of conscientiousness behaviors. Again, things that are not required, but when you engage in these behaviors, it helps it helps the organization in a huge way. Then he talks about civic virtue. This is following the procedures, policies. You would think then these are required, but many policies are not strict requirements, like attending meetings, for example, or participating in certain committees, which is of a voluntary nature. So meaning that they are not required, but you take an active part, and in those committees, and that ultimately helps the organization. The fifth category is sportsmanship. It's about having a positive attitude, irrespective of whether you are winning or losing. You always have a positive attitude. It's being a good winner and not being a sour loser. Okay, so when it's being nice to your employees also, to your colleagues also. When you come to your office, you can come with a sour face and focus on your work, get it done, and leave the organization, right? Because that's what you have been hired for. But if you are smiling, you are nice to them, you are courteous towards everybody, that was not something that was required. But when you were kind and nice to people, that helped the organization, right? So you realize what I'm talking. You should see a theme here. there are many things that employees engage in, that many behaviors that employees engage in, which we typically don't list under the tasks for which they have been hired for. But when people engage in these behaviors, those behaviors actually help the organization in a huge way. So this is another dimension of job performance then. I will give few more examples of OCBs from the newer research that has been done, and then we will move to the third category of job performance, which is counterproductive work behaviors. Here are a couple more examples of organizational citizenship behaviors that I haven't discussed yet. Voice and boosterism. These are some newer categories of citizenship behaviors that have been identified, things that Organ didn't talk about in his initial research. By the way, now organizational citizenship behaviors have been broadly been classified into two categories. OCBOs, which are OCBs directed towards the organization, organizational citizenship behaviors directed towards the organization. So organizational citizenship behaviors, O for organization. And then we have interpersonal OCBs as well. So I could stand for interpersonal or individual. These are organizational citizenship behaviors directed towards individuals or individual colleagues. Ultimately, though, they all benefit the organization. So voice is an example of OCBO. Here you are giving suggestions for improvement, constructive suggestions. You could say, no, that's not my job. That's the manager's job to come up with solutions to this problem. That's not my job. Even if it is not your job, if you find some thoughts, ideas, and if you share it with your manager or the work group, and which then solves the problem that the organization is having, that's a great benefit for the organization. And you realize this is a behavior that is directed towards benefiting the organization. That's the reason it is called OCBO. Civic virtue is something that we have already discussed in the previous slide. So, you engage in those behaviors beyond what is considered beyond a regular requirement, like going to the meetings, which is not even part of which is not even a requirement, and so on and so forth. Boosterism is a unique one, that it's about talking about your organization in a positive way outside the organization. Okay, so wherever you're working, you may be working, doesn't matter, whatever your company that you're working in, you of course meet a lot of people outside your work. Do you talk about your workplace in positive way, or do you talk about it in negative light? And this is something that your organization does not require you, does not monitor even. But when you talk about your organization, your workplace in positive terms, that helps the organization in a huge way, right? So that is boosterism. So these are all behaviors from OCBO. We have, of course, discussed helping, courtesy, and sportsmanship in the previous slide, and you realize these were behaviors focused on individuals or other individuals working in the organization or the department. So you are helping other individuals. Courtesy towards other individuals. You are having good sportsmanship towards other individuals. That's the reason they get classified as OCBIs. There's a lot that can be discussed about organizational citizenship behaviors. As I was telling you, it is one of the most researched areas in the field of organizational behavior. So there's a lot that has been researched and a lot of interesting information, interesting insights that we have got through this research. But, of course, we can't delve too deep into this subject, given the constraints that we have. But I want to finish our discussion on organizational citizenship behaviors, at least by touching upon two main outcomes of organizational citizenship behaviors. The first outcome is something that we have already touched upon, that people, when they engage in organizational citizenship behaviors, it benefits the organization. So there is actually a lot of research that has been done since Organ proposed that it will benefit the organization. So there has a lot of empirical research that has been done since then. All these research provide strong evidence of how people engaging in organizational citizenship behaviors helps the organization, even on concrete objective parameters like increase in overall sales volume or increase in profits. Okay, so there's a lot of research there. So organizational citizenship behaviors then are good for the organization. The second point is something that I haven't touched upon, but which is of high importance as well. There is also a lot of research that has been done which show that employees or people engaging in organizational citizenship behaviors tend to get better performance evaluations. They tend to be rated more positively. And of course, when you get better performance evaluations, you tend to get rewarded accordingly as well, right? If you get better performance evaluations, you will then get probably a better raise, or more likelihood of getting promoted, better job opportunities within the organization, and so on. This is a little paradoxical though, right? On one hand, organizational citizenship behaviors are not required. Yet, when people engage in these behaviors, managers intuitively tend to rate these employees higher. So because these behaviors are not required, often managers don't see it as one of those requirements based on which they are rating these employees. Whatever checklist the manager uses to rate employees, many of these behaviors don't show up there because, as I said, it is not a required part of the job. Still, employees engaging in these behaviors influences the manager in a subjective fashion, and ultimately managers tend to give higher ratings to employees who engage in a lot of organizational citizenship behaviors. In other words, organizational citizenship behaviors benefits both the organization as well as the employees who engage in them. Now, the fact that it benefits those who engage in these behaviors is something that some people may not find to be a fair thing, because one could argue these were not part of the job requirements. Why is the manager getting influenced by the person's organizational citizenship behaviors when he is rating them, right? So on one hand, you could argue that way, but on the other hand, you could argue that yes, it is a fair thing to do because OCBs also help the organization. There's a lot of research that supports that premise, that it helps the organization. From a practical perspective, there is no point in crying that this is fair or unfair. From a very practical perspective, it does make a lot of sense that we engage in more organizational citizenship behaviors because it helps the organization, but indirectly it also helps us in our own career. So that is the reason organizational citizenship behavior has become another important dimension of job performance. So when it comes to job performance, we have discussed task performance as one of those performance behaviors. Within task performance, we had several categories: routine, adaptive, creative. Then we discussed organizational citizenship behaviors. The last category is counterproductive work behaviors, and that's what we will discuss next. Counterproductive work behaviors. These are behaviors that we do not want our employees or our subordinates to engage in because these are harmful to the organization. It diminishes the productivity of the organization. It's bad for the organization. These behaviors are bad for the organization. So task performance behaviors and organizational citizenship behaviors are good for the organization, whereas counterproductive work behaviors, these are bad for the organization. That's the reason we do not want our employees to engage in these behaviors. Sometimes there may be clear demarcation about you not engaging in these behaviors. Many a times there may not be such written documentation. So from that perspective, many of these behaviors are also voluntary, right? People engage in these counterproductive work behaviors out of their choice. But when they do, they harm the organization. So here are some broad categories of counterproductive work behaviors. First one is property deviance. So organizations will have assets, physical assets, right? Something as simple as furniture to expensive equipments in a factory. So when you damage these assets, sabotaging any kind of physical equipment, that is an example of, those are examples of property deviance. Then we have production deviance. So here you are not necessarily damaging the physical assets, but you are engaging in behaviors that reduces the efficiency of the work output. You may deliberately slow down the machinery so that you can work at a slower pace, which is bad for the organization. Ultimately, it reduces the number of outputs that could have been made within that same time. Or you may waste resources. You could waste time, you could waste resources, or you may show up to work all stoned or all drunk, which then reduces your productivity, and then you are not as efficient. So this is again an example of production deviance. Then we have behaviors that are political deviance. While in organizational citizenship behaviors, you are being helpful towards others, you are being nice, courteous towards others, you are keeping everyone informed. Here we have the opposite. You intentionally engage in behaviors that can harm individuals, that can harm others. You may engage in incivil behaviors, or you may gossip about them, badmouth them, trying to bring down the reputation of your colleagues or certain colleague. These are political deviance behaviors. You can imagine such behaviors would create a lot of negativity within the workplace, right? Which would be bad for the organization. Also, in this case, bad for the person concerned, who is the target of such political deviance behaviors. Finally, we have what is called personal aggression behavior. So you are being, hostile, either verbally or physically. So you are being very aggressive. Any kind of harassment, physical harassment, or for that matter, sexual harassment could even come in here. So these are some of the examples of counterproductive work behaviors. When we are talking about job performance, we also need to take the counterproductive work behaviors into mind, because when employees engage in these behaviors, they harm the organization in a major way, right? In terms of impacting the psychological climate of the organization in a huge way in terms of reducing the efficiency of the output, in terms of the monetary cost that may go to fixing the damage. Sometimes this could lead to legal cases that the company may have to spend even millions of dollars. Uh, so counterproductive work behaviors are really bad for the organization, and we do not want employees to engage in such behaviors. Similar to organizational citizenship behaviors, where we classified them into two broad categories, OCBO or OCB, addressed towards organizations, and OCBI, OCBs directed towards individuals, or interpersonal OCBs, right? We have similar kind of classification even in counterproductive work behaviors. So production deviance and property deviance, these are organizational CWBs. So CWBO, these are organizational. When you are damaging the property or trying to reduce the efficiency of the organization by wasting resources or wasting time, you are directly hampering the organization. Then there are CWBIs, or sometimes called CWB personal. Okay, so these are counterproductive work behaviors directed towards other individuals. So when you are being personally aggressive towards somebody, or when you are engaging in this political deviance, gossip, incivility, these are all directed towards other individuals. So that classification can be made. Another way of understanding counterproductive behaviors also can be in terms of their seriousness. So are they very serious? Are they minor? Now this may not be always be very uh, accurate, because theft of, let's say, some small stationery may be minor, but of course if you are stealing huge amounts of money from the organization, then it becomes serious, right? Similarly, substance abuse may seem like a minor issue, but if you are completely stoned and if you come to the workplace um, completely drunk, that could lead to some major injuries in the organization, to yourself or to others. So in that case, it can become serious. But from a very broad perspective, often property deviance is considered more serious than production deviance. And when you are being physically or verbally aggressive, that is typically seen as more serious than when you are just being a little politically devious, and so that is relatively minor. But again, as I said, this seriousness dimension may not always work out as clear. Nonetheless, this should give you some idea about the kind of counterproductive behaviors that happen within organizations, and why, as leaders, you should be aware of such behaviors and work towards minimizing the existence of such behaviors within your organization. That brings us to the end of our discussion on job performance. I barely touched upon the different dimensions of job performance. Of course, we could have gone much deeper, but then that would have made this lecture even long. But here's a mind map that I prepared for everything that I discussed on job performance. Of course, this is not complete, because there are subdimensions also within OCBO, or subdimensions within OCBI, right? We have already discussed this, but I want you to think about preparing mind maps for everything that I teach. That will then put everything in perspective, especially. So this is just an example of a mind map that you could prepare that will help you immensely when you are trying to make sense of complex topics. I prepared this using Freeplane, which is again a open source software that is available, but there are many other softwares that you could use, some paid, some free, but I use FreePlane a lot. That is something that I use extensively because it is open source and it is very functional, very easy to use. In this video, of course, I talked about job performance. In my next video, I will talk about organizational commitment and job satisfaction. These are the two other important individual outcome level variables. Once we finish our discussion on organizational commitment and job satisfaction, then I will discuss various theories of motivation that impact job performance, commitment, and satisfaction. Okay, so that's the plan for the next couple or maybe next few lectures. So that's how we are going to proceed. And once we are done with the motivational theories, then we will move on to the various leadership related theories or leadership related topics. So this is how we are going to set things for the rest of the semester. Thank you.